The individual known in history as Benito Mussolini was born on July 29, 1883, in the small town of Dovaia di Predapio in the Emilia-Romagna region of central Italy. His full baptismal name was Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini. Amilcare derives from Hamilcar, the given name of a Carthaginian general of the 3rd century BC, a major adversary of the Roman Republic during the Punic Wars and the father of Hannibal, who famously crossed the Alps to strike at Rome during the Second Punic War. The Carthaginian middle name is somewhat ironic for Mussolini, given his later view of himself as a leader restoring Italy to the greatness it had enjoyed in Roman times. Benito's father, Alessandro Mussolini, was a blacksmith deeply involved in politics and revolutionary socialist movements in Italy from a young age. He spent several years in the late 1870s and early 1880s under a form of house arrest due to his political activities, and was only released a year before Benito's birth. Benito's mother was Rosa Maltoni. She and Alessandro had married in 1882, and Benito was their first child. Two others, another boy named Arnaldo and a daughter named Edvige, followed in 1885 and 1888. Rosa worked as a schoolteacher and was also politically aware. She and Alessandro named their eldest son after Benito Juarez, the president of Mexico, for much of the period between 1858 and 1872, who led the liberal resistance against French intervention in Mexican politics and the establishment of Maximilian Habsburg as Emperor of Mexico between 1864 and 1867. Mussolini would grow up in a country experiencing mixed fortunes. The Kingdom of Italy had only come into existence in 1861, after centuries of the peninsula's division into city-states of varying sizes. It quickly acquired further territory in the north from Austria during a brief war in 1866, and Rome was captured from the papacy in 1870 after French troops withdrew following the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War. Additionally, the country emerged as one of the major European colonial powers between the 1880s and 1910s, gaining control of large parts of the Horn of Africa and concessions in Chinese ports. In 1911, control was established over Libya, while the following year, the eastern Mediterranean island of Rhodes was secured from the Ottoman Empire. Domestically, the country's politics were fairly liberal and progressive, with a mix of Christian Democrats, socialists, and liberals holding power from 1861 to 1914. However, problems existed. Italy was one of the most densely populated parts of Europe upon unification in 1861, and large parts of the peninsula, especially in the south and on the islands, were incredibly poor. Successive governments failed to address the state's economic problems, and emigration levels were enormously high between 1861 and 1914, with approximately 15 million Italians leaving for the United States, Argentina, and other countries. This indicated Italy's inability to provide opportunities for many of its citizens. Mussolini was strongly influenced by his parents in his early political outlook, particularly his father's views on republicanism and socialism. He attended two schools in the Emilia-Romagna region at Faenza and Forlimpopoli. At both, he clashed with his teachers and was eventually expelled from the first at Faenza due to his violent behavior, disappointing his mother, a devout Roman Catholic who had sent him to Faenza to be educated by monks. He was then sent to Forlimpopoli, where he also encountered difficulty. Nevertheless, he was acknowledged as an intelligent child, and in 1901, at 18, he graduated with a diploma to become an elementary school teacher. Beyond this, his unofficial education came from his father's forge, where they often discussed political ideas, notably socialism and anarchism emanating from Russia and elsewhere. In the summer of 1902, Mussolini delivered a public speech on the 20th anniversary of Giuseppe Garibaldi's death, the leader of the Wars of Italian Unification half a century earlier. Despite obtaining a teaching diploma, Mussolini soon discovered little interest in his mother's profession. Instead, he was drawn to writing and politics and decided to become a journalist. He initially did so from Switzerland, where he relocated in 1902 to avoid compulsory military service in Italy. In the Alpine country, he became a committed socialist and encountered legal difficulty for organizing worker strikes. He eventually returned home in late 1904 and undertook his military service over the next 2 years. A homecoming followed by his mother's premature death at 46 from meningitis. From 1909, he lived in Trento, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There, he worked for a local socialist party and as a journalist, while continuing to read widely. His politics were largely those of communists and socialists, and he taught himself German to read the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the co-authors of the Communist Manifesto. In a sign of how different his early politics were from his later views, he protested against the Italian invasion of Libya in 1911. He was undoubtedly a communist during these years. He was also well-read and a prolific writer, often producing work under the nom de guerre vero eretico, meaning sincere heretic or true heretic. When World War I broke out in the summer of 1914, Mussolini initially opposed Italian entry. The Italian government of the day, despite its long-standing alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, took a similar view and remained neutral. When it finally entered the war in 1915, it did so on the side of Britain, France, and Russia, primarily to obtain lands from Austria-Hungary that many Italians considered Italian sovereign territory. Mussolini soon changed his mind. In November 1914, he founded a newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, the People of Italy, in Milan, which took a pro-war stance. This volte-face in his views on the war led to his expulsion from the Italian Socialist Party. This period was critical in his shifting political stance, and he founded a new political party. He named it the Fasci Rivoluzionario d'Azione Internazionalista, meaning revolutionary fasces of international action. The term fasces comes from an old Latin term for a bundle of rods or a sheaf. In the Kingdom of Italy in the late 19th century, it described a strong, united group of political actors. This is where the term fascism would ultimately derive, and Mussolini's followers soon became known as fascisti, or fascists. In line with his newfound emphasis on nationalism and socialism, Mussolini volunteered for military service. After some initial reservations about calling him up due to his history as a revolutionary socialist, he was drafted at the end of August 1915 and fought in several engagements against the Austro-Hungarians along the Isonzo River, now the border between Italy and Slovenia. He was commended for his service between 1915 and early 1917 and promoted to corporal. His war ended when a mortar shell exploded near him in a trench, wounding him considerably and leaving him with dozens of metal shards in his body. Throughout this period, he became more disillusioned with his previous beliefs in revolutionary socialism of the communist variety and moved toward a more extreme nationalist bent. As the war ended, Mussolini began advocating for Italy's revitalization to become a great power and acquire spazio vitale, literally, living space. The idea that Italy should expand to conquer land around the Mediterranean Sea that the Roman Empire had once ruled over. The idea would later be paralleled in the Nazi concept of acquiring Lebensraum in Eastern Europe. In this, Mussolini was influenced by Giuseppe Bottai, whom he met in 1919, and who would be a major figure in the conceptualization of Italian fascism. The years of World War I were also important in Mussolini's personal life. Around the time the war broke out, he married Ida Dalser, the daughter of a former mayor of Trento, who had studied cosmetics in Paris. They probably met in Trento while Mussolini was working there, and she relocated to Milan with him, often supporting him financially based on her family's wealth and her work as a beautician. The marriage did not last long. They divorced in 1915, though not before she fell pregnant and gave birth to Benito Albino. Benito Sinar's treatment of his first wife and son was appalling. He did not support them and, after coming to power in 1922, had them placed under police observation, repeatedly denying ever having been married to Dalser. He also had records of their marriage systematically destroyed. though one court record has survived in a Milanese archive proving their marriage. Ida eventually died living in semi-house arrest in 1937 under suspicious circumstances, while Benito Albino was placed in an asylum due to his repeated claims to be Mussolini's son. He died there in 1942. As soon as he divorced Ida in 1915, Mussolini married Rachele Guidi, his mistress of several years and the mother of his daughter, Edda, born in 1910. She hailed from Predappio, and her widowed mother had been in a relationship with Benito's father. After his mother died in 1905, they would have 4 further children, 3 sons, Vittorio, Bruno, and Romano, and another daughter, Anna Maria, born between 1916 and 1929. In the immediate aftermath of World War I, many in Italy believed they had been betrayed in the peace settlements between 1919 and 1922. This quickly became known as the Mutilated Victory, a term coined by the prominent Italian writer and politician Gabriele D'Annunzio. Italy had entered the war in 1915 on the side of Britain, France, and Russia, on the basis that it would receive a considerable amount of territory from the Austro-Hungarian Empire once the conflict was over, specifically lands in the Alpine South Tyrol, bordering northern Italy, and along the Istria and Dalmatian coast, on the eastern side of the Adriatic, where Slovenia, Croatia, and Italy meet today. These were lands that many viewed as intrinsically part of historic Italy. Many Italian nationalists also sought control over Albania, ruled by Italian powers at various times in the ancient and medieval past. Some of these demands were met in the peace negotiations, but Albania became independent again, and Italy did not receive all the territory it had sought on the eastern side of the Adriatic, some of which went to the Kingdom of Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes that would later become Yugoslavia. This, along with the country's enduring economic problems, meant that while Italy was one of the victorious powers in World War I, many Italians did not feel that way. Mussolini's nascent fascist movement evolved quickly between 1919 and 1922 to take advantage of this sense of Italian alienation. In March 1919, he founded the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento in Milan, which translates as Italian Fighting Bands, a clear sign of the shift toward more militant politics. They soon formed squadrismo, squads of black-shirted paramilitaries or squadristi who, in the febrile atmosphere of Italian and European politics, in 2008, the post-war era, attacked people of Slavic heritage in Italian cities and towns, the perceived enemy of Italy in the contested Adriatic coastal regions. In a striking sign of Mussolini's break from his radical socialist past, the black shirts were also soon involved in running battles with communists in northern Italy, notably during a general strike in Milan in 1920. The black shirts were the first of numerous fascist paramilitary organizations that would appear in Europe over the next decade, others being the SA brown shirts of the Nazis, the black shirts of Oswald Mosley in Britain, and the green shirts of the Yugoslav Radical Union in the Balkans. The black shirts in Italy would remain a feature of Mussolini's organizations even after he established a new party again in 1921. This was the Partito Nazionale Fascista, or National Fascist Party. It would be the first fascist party to seize power anywhere in Europe. What is perhaps most striking about Mussolini's movement is the speed with which he secured power. The National Fascist Party was established in November 1921, and less than a year later, Mussolini was in charge of Italy. In the 1921 general election, while still campaigning as the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, Mussolini and his followers won 35 seats as part of the wider national bloc. The same election ended in a deeply divided parliament, and Italy's unstable post-war politics continued. Indeed, the situation worsened as Mussolini engaged in a fascist insurgency, seeking to destabilize the country and present his National Fascist Party as the most suitable option to stabilize the situation. Matters boiled over in August 1922 when Mussolini's black shirts effectively seized control of Milan, attacking socialist organizations and appointing their own members to municipal offices. When the national government in Rome did little to stop him in Milan, Mussolini was emboldened. He began preparing to march on Rome, principally from Milan, and ordering units of squadristi to do so from Naples and other towns and cities. The march on Rome commenced on October 28, 1922, and ended 3 days later with over 25,000 blackshirts involved. Mussolini himself did not lead the march, though he appeared at critical junctures to be opportunely photographed as though he did. It all had the desired effect. King Victor Emmanuel III appointed Mussolini as the new Prime Minister of Italy on October 30th. The following day, the blackshirts parading through the Eternal City, he formed the first fascist government the world had seen. Mussolini did not immediately acquire dictatorial powers. It was a gradual process in the first 2 or 3 years he was in office. A number of events helped him consolidate his control over Italy. In August 1923, an Italian diplomat named Enrico Tellini was killed while adjudicating a border dispute between Greece and Albania. Mussolini responded by invading the Greek island of Corfu in September. He subsequently relinquished control of the island, but extorted 50 million lire from the Greek government. While the Corfu incident also helped quell Greek calls for the return of Rhodes and the other Dodecanese islands in Italian possession, it bolstered Mussolini's reputation in Italy, proving that a fascist leader could assert a strong Italian international presence. 2 months later, the Acurbo Law was passed, dictating that the party receiving the most votes in an Italian election would receive 2/3 of the parliamentary seats. This was employed when a new election was held in April 1924. While the election was somewhat fair, the application of the undemocratic Acurbo Law ensured Mussolini completely controlled the resulting parliament. Finally, in 1926, all political parties other than Mussolini's National Fascist Party were banned, completing the transition to a one-party dictatorship. Mussolini became known as Il Duce, the leader, a title Adolf Hitler would later adopt in Germany, using the Germanic Führer. The question arises as to what extent Mussolini was the architect of European fascism, an ideology adopted by countries across Europe in the 1930s. There is no denying that Mussolini was a pivotal figure, not only because he led the National Fascist Party and the Blackshirts to power, but also because he wrote extensively on the topic in essays and books in the 1920s and 1930s, most notably, The Doctrine of Fascism, which he produced in 1927. Yet, others were significant, notably the political philosopher Giovanni Gentile, who served as the Minister for Education early in Mussolini's government. Gentile composed a work entitled Manifesto of the Fascist Intellectuals in 1925 following the Conference of Fascist Culture in Bologna that March, and many other Italian intellectuals signed it. He was also involved in writing the first draft of Mussolini's Doctrine of Fascism. There were numerous others involved in the origins of fascism. For instance, though he opposed Mussolini's regime, Gabriele D'Annunzio, the political figure and writer who devised the concept of a mutilated victory for Italy after World War I, was a major inspiration for Mussolini's ideas. One element of fascist movements seen elsewhere in Europe that Mussolini created was the concept of a fascist secret police. In 1927, as he continued his consolidation of power, Mussolini established the Opera Vigilanza Repressione Antifascismo, the Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Antifascism. This forerunner of the Gestapo in Germany would eventually grow to about 50,000 operatives and was responsible for carrying out thousands of raids and interviews every week to crush activities deemed anti-fascist. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Nazi SS, would subsequently visit Italy to see the Ovra in action. Not everyone looking at the Italian police state's development in the 1920s and 1930s was appalled. For instance, Winston Churchill, the future wartime leader of Britain, expressed admiration for what Mussolini had achieved in bringing stability to Italy and reducing lawlessness, as did many other international leaders. A part of this was because Mussolini and the Italian fascists seemed to have bridled the mafia in Sicily, with Mussolini's appointee, Cesare Mori, overseeing a successful campaign of repression against the Sicilian crime syndicate between 1925 and 1929. Another element of European fascism that Mussolini pioneered was the development of a cult of personality. His public image was cultivated carefully. Newspapers and other elements of the Italian media were censored to present a particular view of him. And a popular phrase was, "Il duce ha sempre ragione." The leader is always right. Mussolini's relatively young age when he seized power, he being in his late 30s when the March on Rome occurred, was noted in fascist propaganda, and his perceived athleticism became a feature of the personality cult around him. This, in turn, fed into the encouragement of fascist youth organizations, while sport became a particular element of fascist concern in Italy. In 1928, work commenced on the Foro Mussolini in central Rome, today's Foro Italico. Modeled on the forums built by the Roman emperors, Mussolini's forum was a giant sports complex with stadiums, tennis courts, and other facilities. Mussolini hoped to hold the 1940 Summer Olympics here, though these games, ultimately cancelled, were awarded to Tokyo. In 1934, the FIFA World Cup was held in Italy. It proved to be a major boon to Mussolini's regime, as Italy won the tournament at home, defeating Czechoslovakia in the final. The team followed here. As much as sport, propaganda, or any cult of personality might have improved the fascist government's image, a powerful way for Mussolini to forge support for his position was to create good economic circumstances. The fascists had largely come to power in 1922 because of the economic and political chaos that had enveloped Italy for several years after the war. Mussolini benefited enormously from coming to power as the European economy began to stabilize and enter a period of enormous economic growth, the Roaring Twenties. The fascists favored a corporatist economic system that sought to promote and develop the Italian economy over importing foreign goods. This led Mussolini to engage in protectionist measures, such as imposing high tariffs on foreign imports to promote domestic industry. Some measures during the era had lasting benefits, most notably draining the Pontine Marshes, a large swamp south of Rome that had been a breeding ground for malaria in central Italy for thousands of years. From the late 1920s onward, a policy of draining these extensive lands and creating model new towns like Latina, Pontinia, and Pomezia was undertaken. It was an immensely successful initiative. Nevertheless, the Great Depression hit Italy as badly as the rest of Europe, giving the lie to the 1930s myth that fascism was a more effective economic system. Ultimately, Mussolini ordered the mass state takeover of the Italian economy, and it would take until the mid-1950s before Italy returned to the economic output seen in 1929 before the Depression began. There has been much controversy over the years concerning Mussolini's approach to the Roman Catholic Church and the Vatican, not least because of the controversial relationship between the Nazis and Pope Pius XII. For Mussolini's career, the more substantial pontiff was Pope Pius XI, who became pope early in 1922, 9 months before Mussolini became prime minister. He would serve as Bishop of Rome until 1939. Mussolini was an atheist, though his mother had been a devout Catholic, and he was somewhat sympathetic to the church. In an effort to resolve some tensions between church and state, complicated in Italy by the unresolved issue of political jurisdiction in Rome, Mussolini negotiated the Lateran Treaty in 1929. This resolved the long-standing Roman question, the unsettled issue of the papacy's political status. The Lateran Treaty effectively created the Vatican City as an independent microstate within Rome. The Pope proclaimed Mussolini as a, quote, man of providence, and an alliance was developed with the papacy in what was still a profoundly Catholic country. Throughout these years, Mussolini continued to play the part of a happily married man, and his second wife, Rachele, remained married and devoted to him until his death in 1945. However, he was a serial philanderer with many mistresses and casual partners. One of the more famous was Margherita Sarfatti, a prominent Jewish-Italian art critic and journalist who wrote a biography of Mussolini shortly after he came to power. We can get a sense of how many others there were from the fact that Mussolini is known to have sired at least 9 illegitimate children with 8 different mistresses. Mussolini's last illegitimate child, Elena Curti, only passed away in 2022 at the age of 99. An important part of Mussolini's approach toward government was the aim of building Italy into a great power and rectifying the perceived injustice the country had suffered at the end of World War I. One of the resentments held by many Italian nationalists was that, unlike Britain and France, Italy had not received control over mandated League of Nations territories, such as Germany's former African colonies or the Ottoman Empire's lands in the Levant. Mussolini sought to remedy this by solidifying Italian control over its existing colonies and expanding them where possible. He began in Libya, a large colony in the Maghreb that Italy had acquired nominal control over in 1911, but remained unstable. Between 1923 and 1932, the pacification of Libya was engaged in. Liberal policies that had been adopted after World War I were renounced, and ethnic laws were introduced that, for instance, forbade intermarriage between Italians and the Arab and Berber natives. Thousands of Italian colonists were also brought in. A fierce war of resistance was then engaged in by the natives, leading to the use of chemical weapons, mass murder, and the development of a concentration camp system by Mussolini's regime. Huge numbers of Bedouin and Berber people were moved from their traditional homelands and resettled as part of a program of genocide and ethnic cleansing. Around 50,000 natives were killed by the Italian government during the pacification of Libya, though precise figures are hard to establish for a country with extremely limited demographic records in the early 20th century. Once the pacification of Libya was completed in the early 1930s, Mussolini turned his attention to the Horn of Africa. Here, Italy had two colonies in relatively close proximity but divided geographically. These were Italian Somaliland, corresponding closely to modern-day Somalia and lying on the Indian Ocean side of the Horn of Africa, and Italian Eritrea, a colony lying on the Red Sea end of the region. Between them lay French and British colonial enclaves and the Ethiopian Empire or Abyssinia, virtually the only native polity in Africa not colonized between 1870 and 1914. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the establishment of the puppet state of Manchukuo had damaged the League of Nations' remit to protect sovereign states' national independence. So, the Italians invaded Ethiopia in October 1935, with little concern for the potential international backlash. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War was fought for nearly a year and a half down to the spring of 1937. The Italians would eventually conquer Abyssinia, though with difficulty, and the campaign pointed to weaknesses in the Italian military that would become glaringly obvious when they faced British and Commonwealth troops in North Africa. Both the Italians and the Ethiopians engaged in breaches of international law, using mustard gas, dum-dum bullets, and engaging in massacres of civilians. The Abyssinia conflict was a nail in the coffin for the League of Nations and demonstrated that the world had moved into a new era of conflict and breaches of international law. The Italians' campaigns of genocide and ethnic cleansing in Libya and Ethiopia in the 1920s and 1930s raised questions about Mussolini's racial views. They differed from those espoused by the Nazis in Germany. Hitler and his followers adhered to a systematic racial hierarchy that held pure races like the Nordic and Aryan peoples of Northern and Central Europe were racially superior to others, like the Slavic people of Eastern Europe. Mussolini had little time for this rigid classification system. He often said that the idea of pure races within Western and Central Europe, where people had intermarried and moved between countries over thousands of years, was nonsensical. However, he adhered to some elements of this. For instance, because Eastern Europe was divided culturally, socially, and politically from Western Europe through the medieval and early modern eras, he accepted that the Slavic people were different from the peoples of Western Europe and was willing to exploit this racial view of the Slavs to claim territory in the Balkans for Italy. Elsewhere, he was nowhere near as anti-Semitic as Hitler or the Nazis, even praising the contribution of Jewish Italians to the country's war effort between 1915 and 1918. While he also had several Jewish lovers, the Italian fascist regime would only begin to adopt anti-Semitic policies in the late 1930s once it allied with Germany. Yet, Mussolini's racial views were clear regarding black people almost anywhere. He regularly made statements about how white Americans would be overtaken by black communities in the United States, and spoke about disparate birth rates between white and black people in Europe and the Americas. Thus, Mussolini's racial views were most prominent when it came to white and black ethnic groups. This explains the brutal nature of the pacification of Libya and the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. Mussolini involved Italy in another conflict during these years. In the summer of 1936, while the fighting was still going on in Ethiopia, the Spanish Civil War erupted after a failed coup in the country. It pitted a right-wing nationalist faction against a left-leaning Republican army. Through a series of deaths of more senior commanders, General Francisco Franco would end up as the leader of the nationalists, and the regime he established is considered a fascist one, though skewing more towards corporatism, a subtle distinction within the era's politics. Throughout the 2.5 years it was fought, European powers contributed forces and aid to one side or the other as it became a proxy war between fascism and communism in Europe. Mussolini supported Franco, viewing it best to have a closely allied fascist regime in Spain, so that right-wing governments had substantial control over the Western Mediterranean. The Royal Italian Navy played a particularly important role, helping the nationalists break a Republican blockade of nationalist territory in Spain's Moroccan colonies. The Italian Corpo Truppe Volontari, a force of Italian volunteers or irregulars, made a major contribution to the nationalist victory, reaching 50,000 men. The Spanish Civil War was also the first episode during which Mussolini was closely aligned with Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Both fascist states provided aid to Franco. However, it is a common misconception that Mussolini was a natural ally of Hitler's after the Nazis seized power in Germany in 1933. In reality, Mussolini was skeptical about the possibility of a German alliance throughout the 1930s. A core issue was the Nazi desire for union with Austria to form a greater Germany. Italy had long-standing claims on land in the South Tyrol region of Austria bordering the plain of Lombardy, creating a rivalry between Italy and Germany over Austria. From 1933 to 1938, during which the Nazis attempted to seize control of Austria, Mussolini was supportive of the Fatherland Front government in Vienna. Only from 1937, once Mussolini needed German support for his actions in the Horn of Africa, and the two began cooperating in Spain, was an agreement reached where Mussolini would not resist German annexation of Austria, provided that Hitler would never claim lands Italy had obtained from Austria at the end of World War I. With this agreed, Hitler went ahead and annexed Austria in March 1938. At the Munich Conference, convened in September 1938 over German claims to the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, Mussolini was a subtle ally of Hitler's, though not overtly at this stage. The growing alliance between Mussolini and Hitler was strange. The pair had very different characters. Mussolini was brash, outspoken, and emotive, photographed in his swimming trunks with famous Italian actresses, a practice Hitler ridiculed. Yet, for all Hitler's seriousness, Mussolini was bored by the Austrians' racial rants when they first met in Venice in 1934. Much of the common view of Mussolini as a buffoon has been derived from Nazi impressions of him and the Italian military's incompetent performance during World War II. But this has been overstated. The Italian dictator was the father of European fascism and had authored multiple books, ranging from writings on politics to a biographical study of Jan Hus, the Bohemian religious reformer whose work was an antecedent to Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. Mussolini even penned a romance novel called The Cardinal's Mistress. At the Munich Conference, Mussolini acted as chief translator, fluent in French and having functional German and English. Mussolini was many things, but the popular view of him as a buffoon or a second-tier dictator with an outlandish desire to restore Italy to the glory days of the Roman Empire is a misconception. He was intelligent, though also immoral and unscrupulous. The Munich Conference only created a reprieve from war in Europe. 6 months later, the Nazis annexed the remainder of Czechoslovakia. By then, Britain and France were rearming, and when Poland was invaded in September 1939, they declared war on Germany. World War II had begun, but Italy would not join it for nearly another year. Despite Germany and Italy having agreed to the Pact of Steel on May 22, 1939, Mussolini decided to wait and see. Encouraged to do so by King Victor Emmanuel III and numerous senior Italian ministers, Paris and London even offered Italy alliance in the war, though Mussolini seems never to have taken them seriously. When Germany swiftly conquered Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium in April and May 1940, and seemed to be seizing control of Paris, Mussolini decided to act. On June 10, 1940, he declared war on France and Britain. Italian troops quickly invaded parts of eastern and southeastern France to secure territory as part of an arrangement with Hitler. In entering the war, Mussolini's valorizing of the Italian past must be borne in mind, and he now sought to reconstitute a large part of the Mediterranean Empire of the late 19th century Romans by acquiring territory from France in the Balkans, Greece, and across North Africa, designs he referred to as the concept of a third and fourth shore, whereby Italy would rule over not just the shores of the Western Adriatic and the Tyrrhenian Sea, but also the Eastern Adriatic and the Central Mediterranean coastline of North Africa. Mussolini and the Italian fascists had already begun their efforts to acquire a third shore in the Balkans even before World War II began. While Britain and France were distracted with trying to curb the Nazis' demands for lands in Central Europe in 1938 and 1939, Il Duce formed a plan to invade the Kingdom of Albania just across the Straits of Otranto from southern Italy. On April 7, 1939, just weeks after the Germans had taken over Czechoslovakia and the city of Memel on the Baltic Sea coast, Mussolini struck, sending an expeditionary force of over 20,000 men to invade Albania. With modern aircraft and battleships, the invasion was successful, and an Italian protectorate was established in Albania a week later. London and Paris made few objections, hoping to win over Mussolini to join them against the Germans. After the defeat of France in the summer of 1940, Mussolini began preparing for an expanded campaign in the Balkans. Greece was invaded in late October 1940, and in the spring, the Italians commenced a campaign against Yugoslavia after a pro-Allied coup there. These campaigns would be less successful than the occupation of Albania in April 1939 had been. Mussolini would call on his German allies to lend further support to the Italian divisions in the Balkans. The diversion of German troops and attention to the Balkans in the spring and summer of 1941 is seen as a contributory factor in the Germans' failure to take Moscow and Leningrad before the Russian winter stopped their advance into the Soviet Union later that year. The inadequacies of Mussolini's armed forces were strikingly on display in North Africa. Hitler's plan was for the Italians to push eastwards from Libya to seize Cairo and the Suez Canal in Britain's protectorate of Egypt. Then, once the Germans had pushed through Ukraine and into the Caucasus, they would swing south and launch a double-sided attack on the British possessions in the Middle East, where some Arab allies were being courted by the Nazis in Iraq and elsewhere. This would secure the oil fields of the Caucasus and the Middle East, which, when combined with the capture of the Suez Canal, would leave the British with little option but to negotiate peace terms favorable to the Axis powers. There was one problem with this plan. The Italian Royal Army performed abysmally in North Africa, following Italy's entry into the war in the summer of 1940. The British, aided by Commonwealth soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India, pushed the Italians back into Libya and scored a victory at the Battle of Beta Fam in early February 1941. A few days later, Erwin Rommel was appointed to head up the Afrika Korps, a German expeditionary force that had been preparing to head to North Africa for several weeks. This force of just over 30,000 men and a substantial tank brigade would turn the tide in the Axis powers' favor, and Egypt was under threat again by the summer of 1941. Still, the necessity of drawing on German aid in the Balkans and North Africa pointed to the hollowness of Mussolini's claims regarding Italy being a newly ascendant great power in the Mediterranean. Mussolini was drawing on ever greater amounts of German aid as the war went on, but steered an independent line on many issues. One was the Italian attitude toward the Jewish population of Italy and the territory it had occupied. Mussolini's anti-Semitism did not reach the levels of Hitler and the other Nazi leaders. Instead, Mussolini's racial views focused more on distinctions between white and black people, and a concern for what he conceived as falling birth rates among the white races. There was no major campaign of persecution against the 50,000 or so Jews who called Italy home under Mussolini in the 1920s and most of the 1930s. A turning point was 1938, as Mussolini drew closer to Hitler and the Nazis. At that juncture, a watered-down Italian version of the German Nuremberg laws was introduced in Italy, removing Italian Jews from government jobs and regulating intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews. These measures were not intensely enforced, and Mussolini had introduced them to appease the Nazis, a sign that Mussolini's regime was not as anti-Semitic as Germany was seen in the movement of many Jews from Nazi-occupied regions to Italy and Italian-occupied lands in 1940 and 1941. The Holocaust would only really strike Italy once the Germans became the de facto occupying power in the autumn of 1943. By the time the Nazis began implementing the final solution in Europe at the beginning of 1942, events in North Africa would lead to Mussolini's downfall, and then a more dramatic second act as dictator of Italy. The source of these events lay in North Africa. After the arrival of the Afrika Korps there in 1941, the Italians and the German Expeditionary Force had regained the initiative against the British, and by the summer of 1942 were threatening to take Cairo and then the Suez Canal again. That was as far as they would get. An injection of British and Commonwealth troops into Egypt turned the tide, and victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein in late October and early November put the Italians and Germans on the defensive. They would never regain the initiative, because as the fighting at El Alamein was ending, Allied armies were making amphibious landings at key locations along the coast of Morocco and Algeria, two French colonies under Axis control. By the spring of 1943, with the great manpower and resources of the United States coming to bear, the Germans and Italians were corralled into Tunisia, where they were defeated in May, bringing the North Africa campaign to an end. Even before victory was achieved in North Africa, plans were underway to open a second front in Europe to take pressure off the Soviet Union by diverting German resources elsewhere. Winston Churchill wanted this new front to be in the Balkans. Yet eventually, the more logical plan was selected. This was to invade Sicily, lying close to the Allied forces in Tunisia, and then cross to southern Italy. Operation Husky began with an aerial bombardment of Italian positions on July 9, 1943. Followed by an amphibious assault on the west and south of Sicily on the 10th, during which over 150,000 Allied troops began making landfall. The Sicily campaign would last 6 weeks before the island was secured by the Western Allies, succeeding in drawing extensive German resources away from Eastern Europe to shore up the defense of Italy. A 2.5-week reprieve followed before the Allies began transferring hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Straits of Messina and through the Gulf of Taranto and the Tyrrhenian Sea into southern Italy to begin conquering Italy on September 3rd. Just over 3 years after entering the war, it was ending in disaster for Mussolini. Even before the conquest of Sicily had been completed, Mussolini had been toppled in Rome. Mussolini was unquestionably the dictator of Italy from 1922 onward, but he did rule alongside others, the Grand Council of Fascism being the regime's foremost governing body. It comprised senior army generals, leading members of the largely ceremonial Italian parliament, and a wide range of ministers and heads of corporate governing bodies. The Grand Council met on the night of July 24th, in the midst of the Sicilian campaign. When Mussolini stated that Hitler was considering a strategic withdrawal from southern Italy to form a defensive line against the Allies in the mountains of central Italy, the former Minister for Justice, Dino Grandi, whom Mussolini had demoted in February due to his criticism of Italian efforts in North Africa, launched an attack on Il Duce. A debate commenced and went on long into the night, with a vote held in the early hours of July 25th on whether Mussolini still had the confidence of the council members. He lost this by 19 votes to 8, Mussolini left and attempted to continue as though he was still in charge, believing that the council could not force through the decision. But at a meeting with King Victor Emmanuel III, he was formally relieved of his office and placed under arrest. General Pietro Badoglio was then appointed as the new prime minister. Mussolini was detained in various locations and taken to the Hotel Campo Imperatore in the Massif of Gran Sasso in the mountains east of Rome in late August. While he was under arrest, the new government of Badoglio was secretly entering negotiations with the Allies to surrender and bring Italy out of the war. Now that the devastation of the country and inevitable defeat lay ahead, to the north, Hitler and his generals were aware that this was occurring and had developed plans for taking over Italy and the Italian armed forces before they could capitulate to the Allies. They initiated this plan, codenamed Operation Axa, in early September. On the 3rd of the month, as the Allies began landing in southern Italy, the Italian government announced it had agreed to an armistice with the US and British. In response, Operation Axe was initiated. German commanders were appointed over Italian divisions, requisitioning hundreds of thousands of Italian troops into the German armed forces. German units flooded into northern Italy, seizing control of large swaths of the peninsula. The Italian government left Rome and headed south to join the Allies, while the Germans seized the capital and prepared to make the Allies fight a bitter battle to secure central Italy. The Battle of Monte Cassino would rage throughout most of the first half of 1944. While Operation Axa was carried out, Mussolini was held prisoner at the Hotel Campo Imperatore on the Gran Sasso Massif. Hitler and the Nazi high command knew they needed a figurehead to impose control over northern Italy and to make clear to the leaders of other Axis-aligned countries in Central Europe and the Balkans that the Germans would support them. Thus, a plan was concocted to rescue Mussolini. On September 12, 1943, a small unit of German paratroopers led by Special Operations Commander Otto Skorzeny paraglided onto the mountaintop near the hotel where the former fascist leader was held, while a separate team secured the cable cars leading up to the hotel. They entered the hotel and rescued Mussolini from the small unit guarding him. A small plane was flown in to airlift Mussolini out. The Gran Sasso raid was successful that even Churchill remarked on it as an operation of, quote, great daring. Mussolini was established as the leader of a newly formed Italian social republic. The administrative capital was fixed at Salo in northern Italy. Though daring, the Gran Sasso raid effectively made Mussolini a puppet ruler for Hitler in Italy. Upon being rescued, Mussolini was flown to Prussia in northern Poland to meet with Hitler at his Wolf's Lair headquarters near Rastenburg. Here, it was made clear exactly how reduced his position would be. The Nazis were to annex the northeast of Italy into the cumbersomely titled Operational Zone of the Adriatic Littoral, while the fascist independent state of Croatia was granted lands on the eastern side of the Adriatic south toward Split. Ironically, these were the lands that had been contentious and led to the idea of a mutilated peace for Italy after World War I, aiding the rise of the fascists. Humiliated, Mussolini returned to Italy. He would reside for the last year and a half of his life at a villa on the shores of Lake Garda near Gargnano in northern Italy. He had little authority over the Italian Social Republic, of which he was the nominal head. Instead, he and his mistress, Clara Petacci, lived here under semi-house arrest, guarded by the SS and having his correspondence screened to ensure no illicit contact with the Allies or the Italian government that had renounced him in the summer of 1943. When interviewed in early 1945, he expressed the view that he was little more than a walking corpse, a puppet for the Nazis waiting to be caught and executed by the Allies. Mussolini would not have to wait much longer for the Allied anvil to fall on him. The Germans and the Allies spent much of the remainder of 1943 consolidating control over their positions in northern and southern Italy. The first half of 1944 was locked in the dual battles of Anzio and Monte Cassino in central Italy south of Rome, with the Allies finally breaking the deadlock in May. Rome was liberated by the Allies on June 4, 1944, 2 months before the liberation of Warsaw and Paris in August 1944. Thereafter, With a Western front opened in France, the strategic priority for the Western Allies shifted from Italy. Although the Allied advance continued into Tuscany and Mussolini's native Emilia-Romagna, while Rome was now used as a strategic base to initiate Allied bombing of northern Italy and Austria. In the interim, the Germans began extending the final solution to northern and central Italy. While the Jewish people in Rome, Milan, Genoa, Florence, and Venice had largely avoided persecution under Italian fascist rule, as soon as Operation Oxa was implemented in the autumn of 1943, the SS arrived and began detaining Italian Jews and deporting them north towards Auschwitz. They were obstructed by ordinary Italians, and over 40,000 Italian Jews, over 80% of the total Jewish population in the country, would survive the war. In early April 1945, as the Battle of Berlin commenced and the Western Allies fanned out all over Western, Southern, and Central Germany, Operation Grapeshot was commenced in Italy. This involved hundreds of thousands of Allied troops moving north to break through the Gothic Line, a series of German defenses blocking the route into the plain of Lombardy. On April 18th, in response to the Allied advance, Mussolini moved from Gargnano to Milan. Unlike German Nazi leaders who would kill themselves before being captured, Mussolini intended to be taken alive and believed that he could negotiate terms through the intercession of the Archbishop of Milan, Alfredo Schuster. But a meeting between Schuster and Mussolini a week later failed after Mussolini resisted a demand by Italian communist partisans fighting the Nazis to declare himself in favor of an unconditional surrender to the Allies. Perhaps Mussolini believed he would be murdered by the Germans if he did so. Within hours of the failed meeting, he and his mistress, Clara, and over a dozen others in the government of the Italian Social Republic left Milan and were heading north, seeking asylum in Switzerland and then Spain, where Franco might look favorably on Mussolini given his aid during the Spanish Civil War. Il Duce would never make it to Switzerland, let alone Spain. On April 27th, he and Petacci were apprehended near Lake Como outside the village of Dongo by Italian communist partisans. They were arrested as they determined what steps to take. It was known that Mussolini, like Axis leaders and war criminals, was to be handed over to the Allied authorities to stand trial before the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg once the war ended. The partisans had other ideas. Under the orders of Walter Audicio, a leading Italian communist partisan, Mussolini, Petacci, and the rest of their party were executed before a firing squad on April 28, 1945, in the village of Giulino. He was 61st. Mussolini and Petacci's corpses, along with other members of the Italian Social Republic's government, Nicola Bombacci and Alessandro Pavolini, were trucked to Milan in the early hours of April 29th and hung upside down in the Piazzale Loreto Square in the city, where their corpses were stoned by a crowd. A day later, Hitler killed himself in Berlin, and 2 days after that, German Army Group C surrendered to the Allies in Italy. The war in Europe ended 5 days later. Mussolini's remains had an unusual afterstory. After his corpse was taken down from the gibbet in the Piazzale Loreto, it was buried in an unmarked grave in the Musocco cemetery in northern Milan. While unmarked, enough people knew the location for a fascist sympathizer, Domenico Lacisi, to dig up his remains during Easter of 1946, seemingly with the aid of 2 Franciscan friars. These were then transported around northern Italy in the months that followed, with one of Mussolini's legs being lost along the way. Hiding places included a villa and a convent, as the authorities sought to track down the body. It was located, and the government chose to have the remains secretly hidden at a rural monastery near Milan. The entire saga ended in 1957 when the government of Prime Minister Oddone Zoli, who hailed from the same part of Italy as Mussolini, agreed to allow the fascist leader's remains to be interred in the Mussolini family crypt in Dovia di Predapio. Mussolini's shadow would continue to hang over Italy and its politics in the post-war era. Christian Democracy emerged as the most important political party, which had its roots in the Italian People's Party, created in 1919 and splintered into pro- and anti-fascist factions. The first post-war Prime Minister of Italy, Alcide de Gasperi, had originally supported the People's Party's involvement in the first Mussolini government in 1922, though he later renounced this support. Christian democracy veered to the right. The 1970s and 1980s were a tumultuous time in Italian politics, known as the Years of Lead and characterized by killings, terrorism, hostage-taking, and lawlessness by far-right, far-left, and organized crime elements. A political atmosphere mirroring the chaos of the 1919 to 1922 period that allowed for Mussolini to seize power. The country has experienced the legacy of economic problems characterizing Italian politics prior to and during the fascist era, namely, the poverty of southern Italy. Given this seeming inability to resolve long-standing economic and political problems, recent decades have witnessed a drift towards the far right of the political spectrum in Italy, with some parties described as neo-fascist. Benito Mussolini was a complex political figure. He was an important individual in 20th century Europe's history, the father of fascism, or the first individual to lead a corporatist and fascist country in modern times. He was also intellectual, writing numerous books, articulating a vision for Italian society after the tumultuous first 60 years of the Kingdom of Italy, and sought an alternative form of socialism to the communism taking root in Russia. Yet, this contrasts with other elements of his life and career. Some began to view Mussolini as a buffoon, a purveyor of ridiculous machismo, and a dictator who proved to be a liability as an ally for Hitler and Nazi Germany from 1940 onwards. The Italian army underperformed everywhere it fought against the Allies. It was only when the Afrika Korps arrived to North Africa early in 1941, and after the Germans took over the remnants of the Italian army in Italy and the Balkans in the autumn of 1943, that the Allies began to meet stiff resistance on both fronts. In this sense, it was fitting that Mussolini had to be personally rescued from his own people by the Germans in September 1943 and spent the last year and a half of his life as a German puppet ruler. Still, we should not view Mussolini as insignificant. His racial views and capacity for mass murder were less extreme than Adolf Hitler's. But in both his colonial policies in Africa in the 1920s and 1930s, and in tying his mass to the Nazis from 1940, he inflicted suffering on many people around the Mediterranean and the Horn of Africa. What do you think of Benito Mussolini? Did he represent a form of fascism different from the Nazis? Or did the actions of Italy in Africa under his watch demonstrate that he was genocidal as Hitler? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you for watching.